Without Van der Poel, would Philipsen have won it? Quite possibly, quite probably. But do I think Van der Poel made it 100% he'd win? 100%.
You got fined, and can you tell us how much that fine was?
I have no idea. No, I have no idea. I think the team paid a fine, but no, I didn't care too much about it, no.
Welcome back to the Unchained Binge Podcast. Everybody, I'm Caley Fretz, joined today by Dane Cash. Welcome, Dane.
Hey, Caley. How are you?
I'm superb. I'm looking forward to talking about sprinters today. Also joined by our resident film and TV buff. I'm going to describe you as that every single episode, Kit. Welcome, Kit Nicholson.
Hello.
And today we are talking about episode 3 of Tour de France Unchained on Netflix. No Mercy. That is the name of this episode.
Yes, in this episode, we dig deep into the mindset of the top sprinters at the race, in particular, Jasper Philipsen, Wout van Aert, Fabio Jakobsen and Mark Cavendish, which of course brings the stage win record into the spotlight. But with sprinting come crashes, and in this episode, there are many, many replays of incidents from the 2023 Tour and beyond. Including
the replay of Fabio Jakobsen's horrible, horrible crash from a couple of years ago. Yeah. We need that in apparently every single series of Unchained, probably forever, unfortunately. But yes, let's get right into it. So the main talking points of this episode is sort of the clash. That's the clash of sprinters, right? And sprinting is a very sort of high octane part of professional cycling. There's lots of crashes, as we see all over this episode. There's also just big egos, right? Like these are sort of known to be, I guess, kind of the biggest egos, kind of the craziest people in the sport, right? Because to do this part of professional cycling, you have to be, I mean, frankly, you got to have a screw loose. Like it's chaos, right? I mean, you're coming into these finales, 60 plus kilometers an hour, bumping shoulders, bumping heads. I mean, you know, we've got bits in here with Wout van Aert, like literally running into fans on the side of the road and then sort of dialing it back because he's about to have a child and is like, oh, I should live through this thing, right? Like, but these are the kind of things that sprinters go through, and so the context or the I guess the sort of what's underpinning this entire episode are those personalities, is that sort of reality of what type of person does this thing.
Generally, they're also extremely confident people. They very much believe in their own chances, and that can lead to them coming off as arrogant, because sometimes they are. And that's another aspect of, I mean, they're like in American sports, you have wide receivers in American football, or like relief pitchers in baseball, where like they are the ones who are the personalities. They're the ones who are often over the top, sometimes abrasive, and you get that with this. Although we'll talk about this in a bit. I think one of the riders that we probably most expected to be particularly abrasive was not a rider who has a long history of being abrasive. At least in this show, came across as very pleasant.
Yeah. We'll get to that in a little bit. So let's just, as we have been doing, let's start with the sort of the main characters of this episode. See if we can provide a little bit more insight into all of these riders and directors and whatever else. So the big one is Jasper Disaster, right? Jasper Philipsen, who you've all seen this episode. So he goes on to win a whole bunch of stages in this particular Tour de France. Was nicknamed Jasper Disaster in the previous series, for anybody who missed that, because he does things like forget his shoes on the way to a bike race, and we get him open the episode with like him and his totally unfolded laundry in his bag, and like him trying to get rid of this particular nickname and change it to Jasper the Master, which we've decided we're not going to be doing. We've also got Fabio Jakobsen.
The show does too.
Yeah, the show basically laughs that idea off.
Well,
right?
He doesn't fold his clothes, so clearly he's a disaster. That's what you get, which I thought was hilarious.
Or he celebrates when somebody else has already crossed the line. That's what I think.
Which is something
that was the other kind of funny one. Yeah. So then we have Fabio Jakobsen, who's coming back from this horrible crash. He has over his shoulder one of the most sort of abrasive general managers. Certainly knows how to craft a quote. Patrick Lefevre, who is his boss. then we've got Mark Cavendish, who is going for his 35th Tour de France stage win. Unquestionably the greatest sprinter of all time, but in his late 30s. So he's, this fight against time thing, he's trying to break this record. He's already tied it with Eddie Merckx. So that's one of the other sort of storylines. But Cav obviously features heavily throughout. And then, we get into some of the lesser characters. We've got the Rudhoof brothers, the general manager, the brothers general managers of the Alpecin-Deceuninck squad that Jasper Disaster is part of. We've got Patrick Lefevre, who I mentioned previously. Mathieu van der Poel, who is one of the biggest names in the entire sport, but plays kind of a bit part in this particular episode.
He's Robin to Philipsen's Batman.
Yeah, exactly. And which is really quite effective, actually. And then we've got Julien Alaphilippe all over the episode, which is a bit weird. But also, Kit, you pointed out, kind of has a useful role in this and a role that's common.
Yeah, and I mean, it's by this episode, I'd pretty much worked out, we'd seen bits of him in other episodes, especially talking about Gino Mader and the effect that crash had on the peloton. He's our viewfinder. He's the audience's filter with which to watch the show. He's got the descriptive elements. He's got the effects that it has on the mindset of the riders. Yeah, I think he's almost like the narrator character.
Particularly introspective, and I think we've said this before, really helpful to get him in his native language. That moment when he said something like "We are nothing," like we're riders, or "I'm nothing," and it's like, wow, that's very intense.
Profound.
Yeah.
Sprinting. We're going to talk all about sprinting today. Let's kick off with the dynamic at Alpecin-Deceuninck, and this, Jasper Philipsen really becomes the center of this show, largely because he ends up winning a lot of the stages, and so he becomes the rider that the other sprinters are hating on, right? Like Wout van Aert and others describe him as just dangerous. Fabio Jakobsen does the same thing, describes him as quite dangerous.
Jasper Philipsen is one of the fastest sprinters out there. He's impulsive, so I do always pay very close attention to him because it could go wrong one day. It is a dangerous sport and we should not make it more dangerous by bumping into each other and deviating from the line. When I had a crash, everybody could see it, how badly that can go wrong.
And we get from the other side this very the actual quote.
In the end, Mathieu got relegated, but it's no problem if you can win a Tour de France stage with that. So, okay, we take it.
Both the rider, Philipsen, and the team are portrayed as a sort of win-at-all-costs kind of operation, right? And that includes riding dangerously. That includes, like the Rudhoof brothers sort of saying out loud that we don't really care as long as we win, that kind of stuff. Is this accurate? Was this a portrayal in the show that we feel like is reflected in what actually happened in the 2023 Tour?
I feel like Jasper Philipsen's sprinting historically has been a bit much, and I feel like they ratcheted up maybe another 25% for melodrama in the show. Like it's not a baseless thing that he is sometimes a little bit of a deviator from his line, but then I also think they ratcheted up the drama maybe a little bit more.
I would agree. I mean, we saw 3 stage wins in this episode, didn't we? And I'm not sure I remember there being quite so much controversy over every single one of them.
Right, totally.
Obviously, there was the Van der Poel relegation, but
that was almost brushed over in the episode.
Right, the one thing that there was a real relegation for.
Yes, but the only moment that Cav had a great quote on that.
Without Van der Poel, would Philipsen have won it? Quite possibly, quite probably. But do I think Van der Poel made it 100% that he'd win? 100%.
I do remember the discussion over the course design and that finishing not straight on the first sprint stage when Wout van Aert sat up and decided, no, I'm not risking this. I'm too close to the barriers. But because of the way that the road markings kind of slightly warped the way that the actual course went.
It also curved.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think that the context around some of those discussions there was they were definitely trying to paint Philipsen as a dangerous sprinter, right? And as you say, Dane, that's not necessarily untrue. He sort of has a bit of a reputation on that front. However, those sprints, I mean, he was not relegated for a reason, right? And in particular, the one with Wout van Aert, which was absolutely a dangerous moment for Wout when he was up against the barriers and he's running into fans, right? If he's had a fan hit his handlebars, I think. I remember reporting on that in the moments after that stage, rewatching it numerous times. The directors over at Visma were furious. Like they were really quite clear when we were chatting with them at the team cars that they wanted to see him relegated. However, the jury didn't, because the whole course curved, and all Philipsen really did was take the shortest line to the finish line, which is what you do, right? You're a sprinter. You're not obligated to leave a door open, right? Is sort of I guess the terminology there for anybody who is relatively new to the tour is sort of closing the door or opening the door, right? Closing the door meaning closing a gap that a sprinter would maybe try to get through. And we've seen sprinters try to get through gaps like that before, right? Like the famous Sagan Cav incident back in the day was Sagan was actually ejected from the Tour de France for that, but it was Cav trying to get through a gap that had closed, right? And it's a relatively common thing in sprinting, and I think that the Philipsen danger thing was slightly overblown, 25% overblown. I think you're right, Dane.
And I think that's useful context too, that if you're not someone who watches a lot of bike racing, if you're relatively new to it, the docuseries makes Jasper Philipsen look like not like the only person who sprints dangerously, but it makes it seem like what he's doing is out of is beyond the norm. And I do think he is a bit more dangerous than most, but they all are engaged in this very dangerous pursuit. Every sprint, everybody is doing very dangerous things.
Every single one of the individual or the riders who were sort of like quoted in this series, in the show, saying that Philipsen should maybe be relegated. So that'd be like Wout and Jakobsen and those guys. They've all been relegated previously at some point in their career. Most of them multiple times. Right. So that is I think important context that, this is a bit of the pots are calling the kettle black. Right. Yeah. I think that's the reality here.
I think what I found interesting about the characterization of Philipsen was that it almost seemed to be, I mean, yes, we've seen him around before. We know that he's a certain kind of guy, and I think when you see him in the hotel room with Van der Poel, it seems pretty candid, pretty honest, pretty authentic. What their little exchange, and it's on the team bus. There is this eternal. In the portrayal of the show, I'm sure they have quiet moments, but it seemed to be this kind of really impatient energy, a really kind of get up and go. They needed to get something done. And one of my favorite moments of the show was when Christoph Rudolph said, "Can I get your attention for just 5 minutes?" As if he was just trying to corral unruly kids at assembly or something. It was, and then you cast your eye around at Van der Poel, who looks a bit sheepish, and Philipsen, who's fiddling with something. It's there's that sort of, so that's funny in itself, but it's also this kind of atmosphere that you don't often see on a team bus, where they're usually, when we see inside them, when they're full, they're very calm and they're very concentrated, professional. Obviously, that we've also seen other buses where they hype themselves up to get going, but it's not in meetings.
I think it's really interesting too, the dynamic of this team, where you have, was it you who caught it kind of a frat boy vibe, and particularly with Van der Poel and Philipsen, and everybody's happy because they're winning. Like it's a great environment because they just keep winning. And that, by the way, has continued into 2024 when they've won a bunch of races outside the Tour de France. The really interesting thing, though, is what is this environment like if they stop winning? And we haven't really had to see that yet. But it's a very fun place to be, and it's all fun and games right now because they are doing so well. If that continues, then they'll probably continue to be enjoying themselves. But having this unruly, teenage boys vibe could go wrong, maybe. Yeah.
Well, I think some of it comes as well from Van der Poel's personality and the fact that he has so much power within the team, too. That's something that was touched on more in the first season of Unchained, as sort of the power dynamics within that team. But it was really a team created by the Rudhoof brothers with Van der Poel, right? Like, they've got this generational talent. They brought him up. They kept him in the team. They built this team around him. It's his team, right? It's his team as much, if not more, than it is their team. And so if he is very relaxed on the bus and he's the one that's, the class clown and they're trying to get him to pay attention for 5 minutes, that would definitely seep out to the rest of the riders, right? And make it a little bit more of an unruly place.
The kids are running the school kind of thing.
Yeah. That's very much kind of what it feels like because of that dynamic, right? Like, which is not not particularly surprising.
But Christoph Rudhoft has that character as well. He doesn't care. He doesn't care. He jokes when he gives his winning speech at the dinner in the evening. If you could all reel it in a little bit, because we're going to go bankrupt if we keep getting fined. It's like there's certainly a character that fits in at that team.
The complete disregard for the fine I found amusing of Van der Poel. How much was the fine? I don't know. That was great.
You got fined, and can you tell us how much that fine was?
I have no idea. No, I have no idea. I think the team paid a fine, but no, I didn't care too much about it. No.
I mean, how much was the fine? Like we could.
Yeah.
It was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 500 Swiss francs,
usually,
or something like that, for an individual who drives a sort of like golden poo colored Lamborghini.
To cyclocross races, which are famously
races.
Muddy.
Yeah. So he doesn't care, and the team.
It was $500, so not
500 Swiss francs roughly 500. Euros.
I think it's 500. I think I actually
close.
had already done that. So I think it's 500 USD ish.
Yeah.
So
it doesn't care, and the team covers it. They kind of address this in the show, but I think generally most teams, the team will cover it if it's something that like helped the team, right? But if it was something that the rider was just being an idiot, then they might not cover that. So the other major storyline of this was Mark Cavendish, right? And from our perspective, from the outside, from sort of like certainly the traffic on any story that we put up, the Cav story was the bigger of the stories here, right? Like, Philipsen winning, great. The relegation questions, whatever. Those are kind of tempest in a teapot, I think, at the end of each stage, and then it tends to fade away because it's so common. But the Cav storyline, the Cav narrative, really underpinned every single flat sprint stage of the entire Tour de France last year, because the whole question every single time was, can he do it? Can he do it? Can he do it? And like the biggest yelp in the press room of the entire 2023 Tour de France was when he crashed, right? Because no one was really paying attention. It was the middle of that sort of innocuous flat stage. No one's really doing anything. Most of the media are sitting in the press room, baking hot press room, watching these TVs, not even really paying attention. And all of a sudden, this, Cav goes down, right? And you can hear it on the French commentary sitting in the press room, and you get this gasp, and that was a huge deal, right? So let's talk more about Cav and the way that they set this up. There's a bunch of early stuff with his partner Peta and his kids, so they're trying to like definitely humanize him. He comes across really well, which I think is interesting, because he's one of
sitting here speaking as three cycling journalists.
So historically, he hasn't always had the best relationship with the press, right?
Other people.
He's been a bit spiky. He's been an absolute dickhead to myself and others numerous times, right? But at the same time, he comes across really well in this, and I think that that actually is a genuine reflection of some of the changes we saw last year. So I remember sitting in the opening press conference with all the major riders in Bilbao at the start of the race last year, and there's a clip from this. You can see the back of my head from when Tadej Pogačar is answering a question in episode 1, I believe it is. So Cav was also brought out for that. It was him, and I think Case Boll was brought out, and a couple of the other top sprinters. Maybe Boll wasn't there. Jakobsen, a couple other guys. And he, in that press conference, was more introspective and more mature than I've seen him in any sort of big press conference scenario pretty much his entire career. So I do think that it was a good reflection of where he actually was in the race last year. Well, how did you guys take it?
I definitely felt he came across as, I don't know, kind of the granddad of sprinting. Not that he is old, but not that he's hopeless or anything.
He's older than all of us.
Yes,
older than even me.
They gave us a window into that, because I think it was Jasper Philipsen at one point who basically said, like, I'm getting older. I mean, I'm not Mark Cavendish. That's like your kind of intro to this guy, is that, oh yeah, he's an old guy. That's one of the first things you see about Mark Cavendish.
And they use that to the show's advantage. He is the expert on sprinting. They came to him, and they asked Jakobsen too, but they came to him for opinions on Van der Poel's relegation and various elements of sprinting that are informative. But yeah, I mean, he just came across as a big softy, and even when he had bad luck. Well, there was the one moment when his bike is mechanical on the stage when he came second. Yeah. But when he was a bit sniffy.
Imagine trying to sprint with the gear going 12, 11, 12, 11, 12, 11.
In the last kilometre, I couldn't change the gears we used.
He was going 11, 12, 11, 12. What can you do then? I was limited. I just have to like this. I'm sorry.
That's never happened to me before. I did a race-winning sprint. It was stuff out of my control, really.
Would you have won if that hadn't happened?
I truly believe I would have.
Otherwise he was the only emotion he showed rather than anger after the stages was this emotion that he was wiping away tears when his family was there. And yeah, he came across as this big softy. He was just, I don't know, optimistic and trying his best, but counting down the days.
Yeah, it seemed when he was in a very good mood, he was extremely charming. You got to see him with his family, and he just looked so happy to be with his family. And then even when he wasn't in a good mood, like you said, with the shifting thing, we've seen him like storm onto a bus, shout at mechanics. His response to the shifting problem he had was so
pretty reasonable,
muted, and out of character for what we've seen from him in the past. That was, I mean, maybe that's just Cav knowing that there's cameras rolling. And finally, but
he's always known there
than he has in the past
rolling.
when there's cameras rolling. Because we've seen him know that there's cameras rolling and still shout at people in the past. But he's definitely came across better.
That was a huge difference. I mean, the famous one is there was a clip of him just absolutely laying into a mechanic from this is probably like 7-8 years ago now, and the fact that he just sort of like almost brushed that off as like, oh, well, that was unfortunate. And considering the fact that the stakes were way higher that day than they have been at almost any point in his career, right? Like, yes, he won his first Tour de France stage. What was it, 2010 or 2011? And I'm sure that was a big one. But then he won 33 more, right? And each one was just another one, just another one, just another one. He cared deeply about them. But this was the day when he was, functional shifting away from winning that stage and beating a record, and the stakes could not have been higher. I mean, I think the general consensus, and he says this in the show, and I think that most of the press corps that I spoke to agree that like he probably would have taken that if he'd been able, if his gears hadn't been jumping, right? Maybe he went a bit early. It's hard to say, but the stakes couldn't have been higher, and his reaction was mature. And I think that for anybody who hasn't been following the sport for a long time, you may be like, okay, yeah, he's just a perfectly fine individual. Anybody who has been following the sport for a long time, it's a dramatic departure from Mark Cavendish of basically the entire 2010s, right?
It's also quite funny that there's another Cavendish documentary on Netflix, which I don't know whether this should be aired, but we recorded a podcast on that show and it was unairable. If you remember. He's a very different character on that documentary as well, from the same race. But I mean, with regards to the record, what I found really interesting was there was no, unless one of you guys picked it up I didn't, but I watched the episode twice and I did not hear the name Merckx once.
Yeah, I don't think they mentioned who he is. He said he is tied for the record, and I don't think they mentioned with whom. Yeah,
which is a really interesting. I mean, I felt given, but then I suppose the reason that we didn't get that partially is because as we were aware last year, the show is not made by a cycling fan. It's not made by people who are in the sport. So the central context, the present tense is all that really matters, and that was the storyline, and it didn't really matter to the wider story that it's Eddie Merckx, the GOAT.
Yeah, I think it's just them not wanting to introduce another person that a non-cycling fan doesn't know about.
Just another impossible to spell name. Yeah, we don't need it. I mean, we need it. We know who Eddie Merckx is, but yeah, from their perspective, that's what they were doing. So, what are the biggest things we learned from this episode?
Well, we didn't learn it, but newcomers might. But as we said at the top of the episode, sprinters have to be willing to take enormous risks, and as Lefebvre said, have to be willing to kill someone, apparently, which came across interestingly.
It's the biggest race in the world, so everybody should kill somebody to win a stage.
Yeah. Well, considering his rider is the one that is probably the closest to have had that happen in a sprint in recent times. Weird thing to say, but also it's Patrick Lefevre, so we're kind of used to him saying things that are not quite right, or maybe they are from his perspective, but they certainly don't land with us particularly well a lot of the time. What else do we learn from this?
Well, I just to build on something that I said in the last episode, I said that last episode gave us a building block of Visma wanting to win everything, and I thought we saw it again this episode when Wout van Aert didn't win sprints. Again, they were not happy. Wout was mad, and it's just sort of an interesting look into a team that wins so much, and yet when they don't win, they're not happy about it, even if they're going to go on to win a lot more.
Maybe that's why they win so much, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I did learn, which I think I'm slightly dubious of, this might be a production element and a good editing moment, but so on the morning of stage 7, so Philipsen's in the green jersey, he's won 2 stages, another big day. Cav is knocking on the door, desperate to win his 35th. There was an interesting conversation between Philipsen and his partner, where she was asking him if he'd been able to settle his stomach and if he'd been able to go to the toilet, and so whether he was unwell. There was also a mention of Van der Poel and the shared room overnight, and yeah, so I felt like that was it was a very handy lift of the stakes. Maybe Philipsen's a little unwell, but again, like I said, I'm dubious. Maybe it's a moment which fell much later in the race, or when he did feel a bit off. But yeah, that was an interesting. That's something that we definitely didn't hear on the day.
Any factually incorrect bits from this episode? No plan B for Soudal Quickstep is the big one
that made me smile. Patrick Lefevre saying basically, so this was after Jakobsen had crashed quite hard. On that racetrack finish, and he was clearly very banged up. And there was a great moment. I mean, great in a kind of televisual, telling the story sort of way. When he was having his wounds cleaned, and you could see him wincing just through his shoulders. And at the same time, that was offset with Lefevre saying, "There's no choice. We brought you here. We brought this rider here. He's got to win. You can't just go home and not win anything." And that's when he said, because we have no plan B, and that we know that is not the case.
If it's too much pain, and you have to consider if it's wise enough to keep going. Maybe I have to quit.
I don't think so. This team was really made in function of Fabio to have one of the best lead-outs. When you're used to win 4 or 5 stages in the Tour, you can't go home without victory. We want this first place again. So Fabio can't give up. I don't have a plan B.
I do think it's worth pointing out that while it is an inaccurate statement for Lefevre to make, him saying that is not an inaccurate portrayal of who he is. Because that is the kind of thing he would say to put pressure on riders. He is someone who, we know this because we cover the sport, he is someone who constantly says things to, in his mind, I think, motivate his riders. In the rest of our minds, to...
It's a very old-fashioned form of motivation.
Yeah, to borderline, abuse them. Not physically, but, he says things that really are not great. And we're going
to get more of that later in the season.
And we've seen it
is it this
year in, year
episode
out
or not? Is it this episode or not where with the Ala Philippe, how much?
No, that's later.
It's in the trailer.
But it's also
but it's in the trailer.
It's where
they ask Ala Philippe, how much he gets paid, and he says a little bit too much for Patrick Lefevre, which is just great. It's a great response. I really enjoyed that. It's a couple Easter eggs in here. The mention from Philipsen that they're in the best hotel they're going to get all race, right? And it appears to be a very nice hotel, dropped off in a golf cart. There's a little pond outside. Looks lovely. For those, I guess, the uninitiated in the Tour de France, that is actually pretty unusual. And you'd think that these riders, who many of whom are making millions of dollars a year, right, millions of euros a year, would get to stay in nice hotels throughout the month, but that is absolutely not true. Some of the hotels that they do stay at are shocking. No air conditioning. Like they pretty much always have roommates, which that's fine. I think that's not the worst thing. But yeah, some pretty shocking hotels throughout the course of the month, and I think that's just something that folks new to the tour maybe wouldn't get. But it's a moving circus. When you're in the middle of the Alps somewhere, there's literally not enough nice hotels to put everybody in. So they do this kind of like cycle where if you've got a good hotel, your next one's probably bad. The next one after that's probably okay. And then maybe you get back to a good one. And so in theory, every team gets a couple good hotels throughout the month, a couple terrifying hotels throughout the month, and a pile of very average hotels throughout the month. Just a little Easter egg.
Almost quite interesting that Van der Poel had the foresight to be able to say, this is the last nice hotel we're going to have, which was like stage 4 or 5, almost like he looked ahead, which is very unlike cyclists. They don't know where they are.
He might just assume that too. It'd be a pretty good assumption that was going to be the nicest one of the entire month. We have found ourselves staying in the same hotels as teams pretty frequently at the tour, and more often than not, that's because they've been stuck in an Ibis budget on the edge of the highway, right in outside whatever little town we're in.
A little bit of insight from having covered bike races in person. One thing that's really cool about being at a bike race, especially if you're in that position where you're in the same hotel, for the longest time, they would even put, just to give the riders and staff members a little bit of information about where they were going or where they could find their teammates, they would just stick like a printed out copy of everyone's room number, and they'd put it right next to the elevator so that if you're staying in that hotel, you could walk right in and see, oh, hey, look, Mathieu van der Poel is staying in room 307. And if you're just like a fan and you want to see Mathieu van der Poel, it's shockingly easy to do so. If you are going to a race where they are also at a hotel nearby, just go look around the hotels. You will find your Van der Poels and your Cavendishes. And at least a few years ago, you would have been able to see what room they were staying in for a lot of those teams. And if you just hang out in the lobby, they're going to come out. It's actually pretty cool if you're a fan.
That did change somewhat with COVID.
Yeah.
Locked down a little bit more. And in fact, they don't release the hotel list publicly anymore. So the press used to get a list of hotels where all the teams were every single night. And so that was a pretty common reporting tactic, as you would just go sit in the lobby, or you would text a rider or text a director and say, hey, do you have 5 minutes to come down and chat? And more often than not, back in the day, they would do that. That has become harder and harder, and that's the sort of the access has become less and less particularly it was sort of accelerated by COVID, and they've kind of used that as an excuse to continue. I think teams are also realizing that like keeping riders healthy is important, right? So, Jumbo-Visma wears masks, not necessarily for COVID, but just to prevent any kind of illness, right? Like or trying to prevent any like decreasing the chance of illness by even a little bit is something that they're going to do, because a rider gets sick at second week of the Tour de France, they're now useless to the team. So there's high stakes to that sort of thing. And part of that is not allowing lots of random people to wander around in the places where the riders are. Mm-hmm. It's, unfortunate, but also understandable, I guess. That is a pretty incredible thing about bike racing, though.
Can I have one more Easter egg, please?
Yeah, you could chuck another one in there.
Somebody mentioned this on Discord, and I'd noticed it too. I think we saw it in the first episode, but it's more obvious in this one. Van Aert's massive scar on his upper thigh, and we see the crash in this episode, which was from 2019 to also, I think, so it's a long time ago now. And he was out for 6 months, and he more or less had to not learn to walk again, but he had to retrain those muscles, because those that you can see from the extent of the scarring from those massage table images, those muscles were completely severed, and so and in this episode it's particularly, I don't know, it's poignant because we're talking about the risk that these riders take. And no, that crash wasn't in a sprint, but it's like what Alaphilippe says, we're very vulnerable as bike riders, and you can see what damage can be done. I mean, it's a huge wound. It's like at least 6 inches long. So basically his leg caught a piece of fencing as he was going around that corner. They show the crash in the show. It's one of the thumbnails on Netflix. That the image of him of him kind of wailing. It's one of the thumbnails for the show.
was 2019. It was the time trial that Julian Alaphilippe won that year. He was in the yellow jersey still. It was in Po. And Ian Trelor and I were at the race that day. We walked to the corner after we heard this had happened. We walked to the corner just to see what had happened and to take a look. And yeah, it was just like a pool of blood underneath a fence. And you could see, so those fences kind of click together with these metal bits, and he had basically just caught the metal bit going 55 kilometers an hour around this right-hand corner, right near the finish, actually. Like, we were at the finish, and we were able to walk there within 5 or 10 minutes. It was gnarly. And I think people forget that Wout actually came back from that.
Yeah, there was a lot of question. There was a lot of doubt as to whether that would actually happen.
Sort of a random time to bring this up 3 episodes in, but I think it's worth pointing out. A lot of context that's sort of left out of the show is what those who follow the sport, know about certain riders. And you mentioning Wout van Aert's time trial crash when Alaphilippe had also won that stage reminds me that if you're a viewer of the show, you might not know, for instance, that Wout van Aert and Julian Alaphilippe were or are 2 of the best riders in the world. It's been a little while since Alaphilippe was, but he is a 2-time world champion who won a ton not very long ago. And then
he won a
Wout van Aert
fantastic stage at the Giro earlier this year.
True.
So
Yep.
I'm not saying he's the best again.
It was a comeback win for him, though, because it was such a long period without something like that.
There was about a week and a half in that 2019 tour. There's about a week and a half where we thought he might be able to win the tour.
Yeah. And Van Aert, also last year's Unchained, you got to see a lot of just how good Wout van Aert is. But since the show has been on, Van Aert himself has not done as much at the tour as expected. And again, that's sort of a thing where I think, in case you didn't have this context, if you're relatively new to the sport, you should know that Julian Alaphilippe and Wout van Aert are both really good bike racers, or at least were.
Yeah, and the Tour de France is always the pinnacle of the season, so everyone is on their best form. Everyone is as positive as they can possibly be. Their mentality, their training, it's all been as good as they can possibly make it. So it's the Tour de France is cycling through rose-tinted glasses.
So let's get to our awards here. We're going to bring back the portrayal-o-meter. So this is a spectrum all the way from accurate to absolute nonsense. So Alpecin-Deceuninck and Philipsen as the villains and Cav as a big softie. How does that fit on our portrayal-o-meter?
We've said this before. I was pretty shocked at how charmed I was by Cavendish, but I don't think it was fake. I think he is charming when he's in a good mood. And I thought that it didn't jive with my preconceived perception, and yet at the same time, I think that may be a real thing. He's a charming guy when he's in a good mood.
Yeah, when the media and the people he's dealing with are on his side, he is very warm and pally with everyone.
Who are our contenders for this episode's Razzie? Worst actor of episode 3. Keeping in mind, again, that we're refusing to punch across or punch down. Yeah. We're only punching up on this. And so, like, for example, the partners of riders who have clearly been asked by Netflix to ask a question, we're not including them in this because that's not their fault. That's Netflix's fault. So, the GMs. I think Lefebvre.
Yeah, but this was
is he acting though? It's just him.
No, it's just him.
And I think that's also true of Philippe Roodhoof too. I think he just is the way that we saw him.
Christophe Roodhoof. Yeah.
I don't know that anybody.
So is there no Razzie?
Maybe
no Razzie
I don't think anybody seemed
3?
over the top bad at. Yeah.
No, nobody looked out of their depth either in front of the camera.
I mean, Philipsen was a bit odd sometimes, but I think he's just a bit odd. Oh. All right, no Razzie for this week. Everybody was a good actor this week. Okay. And finally, our most prestigious award. I think we have a couple options for this one this week. The Jonathan Vaughters Understands the Assignment Award. Who understood the assignment best?
We have 3 nominations.
Yeah.
Should we do a slow motion? The nominations are an open and no. So, I put Peter Todd in there. So Peter is Cavendish's wife. She's been around the cycling circus for a long time. She's been in media for even longer. So
it's one way to put it, yeah.
Yeah, well, she knows what she's doing in front of a camera. And she came, the conversation between herself and Cav seemed at the most real of all of those conversations, especially the part where Cav said, I haven't crashed in ages. And she goes, you're saying that 1 week before the tour? And it just seemed very real, very kind of like something she would say.
And a good quote.
Then we've got Christoph Rudhoft, who doesn't care about fines.
Really quick on that. My favorite thing about that moment was they were looking around for something wood to tap. But they're like hyper modern house, which she actually mentions. Like there's no wood anywhere.
That was great.
Like, looking around all over the place. Yeah. Sorry,
I like that too. Yeah, and then I think Christoph Rudhoft and his bluster about not caring about fines and just we don't care what anyone thinks, but also just we want to get rid of the disaster nickname. I felt like that was he was he's probably spoke most in this episode. Maybe alongside Philipsen. And then, of course, the last nomination has got to be Lefebvre, who was just doing a very good imitation of himself.
Yeah, it was him being him. The stakes were high. But he
also understood the assignment, right?
Yes,
he very much And one thing you could say about Patrick Lefebvre always, and most, I think that the general consensus here at Escape is that Patrick Lefebvre is not our favorite individual, like as a human being. Which is nothing about his actual team. Like it's the winningest team of the last decade, I think. But he's not a good dude, right? But he does understand the assignment always. He always understands the assignment, and so for me, the Jonathan Vaughters understands the assignment award goes to Patrick Lefebvre. I think this week or this episode. Yeah,
I think we can go with that.
Are we in agreement, Dane? Yeah,
I think you get
Dane. They can't hear you nod. Dane.
Right. I think you get a sense of him from this show that isn't the whole picture of him, but it's at least a sense of really what you get with him. That I feel like in his limited appearance, he's probably on the screen for like 2 minutes or something in the whole episode, but you really do get a sense of who he is and how he views the world. And fortunately, you don't get the whole thing because there's probably some.
And this assignment isn't about like, is this an accurate portrayal of this individual person? No. This assignment is about, did this person understand
and he
how to give a quote to Netflix?
And he does.
That
absolutely.
They would definitely use in the show.
Yeah, and you get that from him. You definitely understand. You definitely see that he gets that.
Yep. All right. So congratulations, Patrick Lefebvre. It's the first and perhaps only award we will ever give you. Did you enjoy the episode? Did you enjoy it? Did you like this one? I didn't particularly like episode 2, and I think that's just because I'm not Australian and I don't actually care whether Ben O'Connor and Jai Hindley like each other. Like it's just I found that a difficult one to like get emotionally invested in. The sprinting one I think was very interesting. I think it was the most insight into bike racing that we've had thus far. What do you guys think?
I felt it really clipped along at a great pace and there was real momentum to it, and they had all the different characters, which is, and another important note is that they were easily distinguishable from one another.
Yeah.
And when you've got so many people involved, I think episode 1, I paused halfway through and I was like, oh my God, there's 30 minutes left. And it was because there was so much going on. And obviously I know who these characters are. But this episode, it just felt well contained and well produced, and it was it was a more compelling, more engaging episode for that reason.
And I think in conjunction with all of that, it was to me very impressive that with all of the engaging stuff happening, there's multiple different characters that you have to keep track of. I think they also did a really good job being informative about what's happening.
Yeah.
To those who maybe don't know, there was a brief moment where Jasper Philipsen described the green jersey that I thought was a very succinct, useful thing if you're new to this. And he was quick and it got to the point. That was great. I thought there were moments where we heard from Cav about sprinting, what it's like. And again, I think that was just some very informative stuff there for the fans who maybe aren't as plugged in. So the fact they were able to balance those bits of exposition with also giving us all these characters and the vibes that you're getting from the Alpecin dudes versus Cav. That was a really good job of just production in general.
Agreed. I agree. Yep. Episode 1, good. Episode 2, fine. Man. Episode 3, better. I'm going to tell you right now, episode 4, which is what we'll talk about next episode of this podcast, is a bit rough. In a just an emotional way. So the title of the episode is For Gino. Right. And everybody will know from the first episode that, this is all taking place 2 weeks after Gino Mater died at Tour de Suisse. Make sure you come back. We're going to chat all about episode 4 for Gino. Next time, as always, head over to escapecollective.com. Check out the rest of our Tour de France coverage. Make sure you don't get hit by that paywall. Sign up now. Get this podcast. Get lots of other podcasts. Get all of our members-only podcasts. All sorts of good stuff. We are going to be running the Tour Daily podcast once again this Tour de France. Head to your podcast app of choice. Search Escape Collective. You can dig up everything that we do. And finally, go to escapecollective.com/member and sign yourself up, because everything we do here is supported by our members, and we love you very much. All right, we'll see you next time, episode 4 of Unchained. Thanks for joining, Dane.
Thanks, Caley.
Thanks, Kit.
Always good to be here.
Bye-bye.